Hi, I'm Alex, and today I wanted to demonstrate function calling with OpenAI's large language models using a little application that I created called the API Ragulator. And the idea here is that maybe we could use large language models to help us search other open APIs to get information to help us answer questions. Now, most of us are familiar with RAG, which is Retrieval Augmented Generation. And this is a version of that uses a large language model to create a query that we can then, access to get information from the API. What's fun about this is that all we do is give the large language model documentation on the API and our query, and we let it try to figure out how to structure the API call. So let's dive in and take a look at how this works. So what we're doing here is we're using Google Collaboratory. And the first thing that we do is we install OpenAI. We also, over here under our secrets, have our OpenAI API key available. So we have a few functions that we're defining. First, we have get API query from tool calls. This is because when we're using function calling, we don't just get a message back from the OpenAI API or GPT 3.5 or GPT 4.0. We get tool calls, which is a list of functions and arguments that the large language model thinks we might need to use to answer our query. So we also have over here a function to generate our API query, and that's using function calling here. And what we're telling it is we're saying that we have one function that the API can use. We have one tool for GPT-4 to use, and that tool is called run query. And what that tool, which is a function we have, what that can do is it can take an API query and it can try to access that site at that query and get the information from it. It's very simple. We're just telling OpenAI that we have a tool that if it gives us an API query, we can get that information. And so that's it. We have one function, one tool that we're asking OpenAI to use. And the rest of this is just about returning the tool calls, which is hopefully an API call. That's it. So then we have a regular function, execute API query. Very simple. It's just trying to do a GET request to get the query that we're having the large language model build for us. And we have generate AI response, which is just a generic function to send a regular query without function calling, because we're going to do that as our second layer. And then we have get rag response, which puts that all together. So when we look at this get rag response function, we can see it takes some API documentation, our user query, a model, and then the temperature and the max tokens, which are parameters for model generation. The first thing we do is we generate an API query using the API documentation, the user query, and the model specification. And that is going to give us some tool calls. We'll print them just to see. Then we're going to get the API query out of the tool calls. That's pretty trivial. Then we're going to get a response by trying to execute the API query. If the large language model, if GPT has done its job, we'll get some data in response. Then we're going to create an updated user query. The API response is, and then we give it the API data that we got, and then answer the user's query as best as possible with this info, and then we put in the user query. Then we'll be able to get our RAG response by giving it all of those things. We generate an AI response, a regular generative AI response with the model, the temperature, the max tokens, and our updated user query, which again has information from an API using a call that the large language model built for us using function calling. So let's look at an example of what this actually might look like. So the most famous open information API that I could think of was Wikipedia. So I looked up the Wikipedia documentation. I found a good example and I went and just copied it in right down here into a variable called Wikipedia API doc. So that's down here. Then I have a query, which is how many people live in London? And then we're going to pick GPT-4o because it's better at function calling. And after we generate an API query and we get tool calls back. And we get a chat completion message tool call object. We get a list of them actually. And this has one object in the list. And that object has a property function. And that function has properties API query and the name of the function we're running, the run query. So it has arguments, and the argument is API query and the actual API query it built for us. So that's what's happening here. Wikipedia has built this query. It's saying, we're going to search London population. Not how many people live in London, because it's generating a query it thinks will help us answer this question, but not necessarily directly copying the query into the API. So then we call the API, get API query from toolpals, we get that API query, we get the response, we print the response. The response is a bunch of JSON with some information that's hard to read. We get our updated user query, we get our RAG response, and now we have a better answer than we would get from GPT-4o by itself. It has an answer informed by a call to Wikipedia. So this is fun, but you could build that all on your own by just building something to query the Wikipedia API. So what's a more complicated example of this? Court Listener is another famous project by the Free Law Project, and they have an API for querying court records in the United States. That's a more complicated API. There's a lot more information here. There's a lot of different API routes, and I copied all of that into a different variable here called Court Listener API doc. No formatting, just copying it all in. With this API, we might ask a different question. The question might be cases decided by Sonia Sotomayor. And then we'll run the entire pipeline to get a RAG response. And we'll see it gets a chat completion message tool call. And it builds an API query to query the court listener API for cases decided by Sonia Sotomayor. And then it gives us a list of cases decided by Sonia Sotomayor. So this information is information that actually came out of Court Listener, but is being told to us by feeding it through a RAG pipeline. What if we looked for cases decided by Sonia Sotomayor in 2020? It's going to give us a different search, and that search is going to generate more relevant information and results. These cases are different cases decided by Sonia Sotomayor, and the decision dates of all of them are in 2020. So this is a fun little example of function calling, but it's a little bit flying by the seat of your pants. So the next thing that I'm planning to come up with for function calling is a customer service agent that should be able to act as a tier 1 support agent for your customer service email. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next update.